Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I am going to be talking about the new album from Underworld. Barbara, we face a shining future. So, Underworld is an old 90s techno act fronted by Carl Hyde and Rick Smith, and also Darren Emerson from 94 to 2000. There's been a few other lineup changes since then, and in fact, they were a full-on new wave band back when they formed in the late 80s, but most people know them for their straight techno work, starting with their 1994 album, Dub No Bass With My Head Man, and especially their 1995 single, Born Slippy Nux, which made it onto the movie Trainspotting and shot them to success, reaching number 2 on the UK Billboard charts and becoming one of the most well-known songs of that era. Though they're kinda known as a one-hit wonder with that one song that wasn't even included on any of their albums, they do have a pretty extensive back catalog, this being their 9th album to date. And I'm gonna have to be totally honest, outside of their albums Dub No Bass With My Head Man and its follow-up Second Toughest in the Infants, I never really got into them or looked into them in depth until recently. I think I got to Bo Coop Fish and fell asleep, ending up with Me Moving On, which is a real shame because after hearing that they had a new album out, I rushed back to them and catch up on the stuff that I missed. And before long, I realized that I really love these guys. I mean, duh, they're an old 90s techno outfit, of course I'm gonna love them. But as I went through their back catalog, I realized there really wasn't anything from them that I didn't like. In fact, I think it's about time I brought back a certain review segment of mine that I haven't used in a long time, so I can go down their discography so far. Aside from the recognizable voice of Carl Hyde, this sounds like quite a different band. More like synth pop or new wave along the lines of The Cars or something. It's got its moments though. Pretty much same deal as the previous album. Reminds me maybe a little more of U2 this time? I don't know. This is where they turned into the well-loved old-school techno outfit we know them to be today. This album is considered a classic by many a techno fan, and while I think it's fantastic, I don't know if I'd quite call it a classic, especially since they topped it not long after. Still deciding on whether or not this album is better than Dub No Bass With My Head Man. Right now I'm leaning more towards this one, but we'll see in time. A bit different from their usual stuff thanks to the departure of Darren Emerson, got some guitar-focused and more indie-rockish material, but believe me when I say this is barely a dip in quality at all, really a great album as well. Even more down the more experimental and chilled-out road, and while it didn't impress me quite as much as the previous couple of albums, it is still quite interesting and worth checking out. This time, they started to incorporate newer styles of techno and progressive house, and while it was fairly solid, it was still kind of a disappointment. Also, Carl Hyde's voice weirdly reminds me of Moby in a few spots, which was weird. Which brings us to this album. Going into this album, I had my fingers crossed that they didn't keep up the newer styles found on their Barking album. I mean, Barking sounded good, but it didn't really sound like Underworld to me. I was optimistic though, as these guys are not really the type to rehash the same album twice. So, how does this one turn out? Well, while I will have to say it's probably not as good as their Darren Emerson days, it is probably their best since 100 Days Off. I do actually think this album holds some similarities with 100 Days Off, in that it took the original Underworld sound and maybe took it down some more rock-influenced passages, but this album actually tries some different things to separate itself from that album. I'm detecting maybe some post-rock influences on certain tracks, but let's go down track by track. The opener, I Exhale, is the most traditional Underworld track on here. Fast-paced, foot-tapping techno with this huge booming bass line, and of course Carl Hyde doing his usual half-talking, half-singing shtick, not unlike Born Slippy or Pearl's Girl. If Ra is next, and while it turns down the tempo, it's a bit slower, it's no less intense. In fact, it might even be a little more intense, especially as the song goes on. I can see this track flowing into older tracks of theirs, like Bruce Lee, which is also kinda slow and choppy, but still intense, driving and foot tapping as always. Low Burn is where things really start to get interesting, as this track has kind of a cinematic edge to it that I've never really seen out of these guys. I think there's even some orchestral sounds in here. It's got a really triumphant and happy feel to it, maybe kind of like earlier singles of theirs like Jumbo or to a lesser extent 2 Months Off, but much smoother than either of those two, maybe more like Surface to Air by the Chemical Brothers. But definitely an awesome track. Santiago Quatro is the shortest track and is mostly a guitar-driven piece, like some of the stuff on 100 Days Off, but maybe with more of an ethnic Spanish feel to it, as you might guess from the title. As quickly as it's over, it definitely leaves an impression and breaks the mold in an effective way. Motorhome is another slower piece, but this one is not nearly as energetic as Ifra. It's more intimate and quieter, and with Carl Hyde doing more actual singing than half-singing on previous tracks. Maybe wouldn't have been unfitting on their Oblivion with Bell's album. Ova Nova is another more colorful and happy, melody-driven track, again with more Carl Hyde actual singing. In fact, its colorful and streamlined feel make it feel like it could have been on their Barking album, albeit not obviously pandering to newer trends. Finally, the album ends with Nylon Strung, another very melodic track. This track in particular is where I picked up some of the post-rock elements, maybe a hint of explosions in the sky among their more melody-driven techno. It's really another great track. So, overall, this album has quite a bit of variety in it, which is always nice, but it doesn't feel disjointed or out of character either. And on top of that, it covers territory previously untouched by other Underworld albums. In fact, its overall feel reminds me quite a bit of the Chemical Brothers' Further album, in that it had a condensed but surprisingly large and cinematic vibe to it. And also in that it's also a great late period album as well. That being said, there is of course one thing about this album that holds it back for me. Its running time. At only 7 songs, and only one of them actually breaking the 8-minute barrier, I was left just kinda hungering for more. I, and I assume most other Underworld fans, would have liked this album a lot more had they tried for something with more ambitious song lengths. For instance, Second Toughest in the Infants only had 8 songs, but there were some that were like 15 or 16 minutes long and had multiple parts. That being said, I highly doubt these guys have another Second Toughest in the Infants in them at this point, but at the very least, I'm glad to hear they're on the right track again, and who knows, maybe they'll do something even crazier in the future. But this is definitely one of their best in years, and I'd highly recommend it. It's a must-listen for Underworld fans, although I'm gonna guess there's very few Underworld fans out there who haven't already heard this album. But overall, I'm feeling a solid 8 out of 10. Favorite tracks, I Exhale, If Raw, Low Burn, and Nylon Strung. Least favorite track, I think I'm gonna go with Motorhome. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. Leave the comments in the comment thing so I can hear your thoughts. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.